That night, an exiled reader returned to the Commonwealth. He was to be the last. The stars had faded and the cycle of the rites had run its course. There's a danger, huh? A reader in the Commonwealth. He found the Commonwealth in a state of unrest. Spurred by the efforts of 5 liberated exiles, Volfred Sandlewood's revolutionary plan had incited the masses. These exiles, and the starless sky, portended the return of the scribes. The rulers of the Commonwealth pushed back. Fighting broke out in the streets, in spite of Sandlewood's intentions. It was then that the winged high-wing remnants chose to strike. Allegations that the high-wing remnants were in league with Sandlewood were never proven. However, there was no denying the result of the two-pronged attack. After enduring for almost a millennium, the Commonwealth had fallen. The new Saurian Union declared its sovereignty in the next year. Among the changes its elected leaders ushered in, they vowed never to cast their people into exile, and they abolished the old Commonwealth decree forbidding literacy. Today, we still remember all this. And we remember the exiles of the downside whose deeds led to the dawning of our age, whether they returned or not. Boy, this is my chance to explore the list of characters. It is. The left is our characters, the right is their character. Wow, I made a perfect weird little V shape on the screen, didn't I? Why is you... Weird, you have a... Choose someone to learn what became of them since last you met. Well, yeah, I understand that much. So many characters here. Boy, oh boy. Let's start in the corner. Start with the enemies first, perhaps. After the final liberation rite, Lendl refused to believe that the rites had truly ended. He would sit through the night after consecutive night, staring into the blackness of the sky, awaiting any kind of sign that he might gain another chance at freedom. No such thing ever came. His fellow accusers started to express concern for him. Survival had become their top priority once liberty had slipped from their grasp. But Lendl dismissed them as weak fools. He insisted rather forcefully that any evening now the stars would shine for him again, and mark the way towards his inevitable freedom. He was, of course, mistaken. The others of his triumvirate were left with little choice but to abandon him. After that, the exile known as Lendl the Liar was never seen again. However, there have since been sightings of a bedraggled demon who wanders the downside and bears Lendl's cruel countenance, suggesting he yet lives. As the cycle of the rites drew to a close, it grew evident that a chance at freedom from the downside had forever slipped from Dalbert and Almer Oldheart's grasp. Thus, they and the exiles of the Fate returned to Jomwara Valley. There, they struggled to get by, as exiles of the downside tend to do. Sometime after the rites had ended, the Oldhearts at last heard the news that the Commonwealth had fallen. This was well after the fact, of course, but it brought old Dalbert great joy. Despite his forthright manner, he had no love for the nation that cast him down, along with his son. Dalbert Oldheart passed peacefully in his sleep before the next new moon. Oh. In his final days, he implored his son to undertake a pilgrimage to the scribes. Almer never shared his father's view of the scribes, but respected Dalbert's wishes, and so, after a period of mourning, Almer began a new journey. One day during his travels, he ran almost headlong into another exile after paying homage at the spring of Jomwar. He was stunned to find that this was none other than the one he knew as Faye, from their days as adversaries in the rites. Faye was overjoyed to see him, although Almer was unable to bring himself to understand why. Eventually, of course, he did, and they remained together, growing ever more accustomed to their new lives in the downside. Not a day went by that Almer Oldheart did not think about his father, and give thanks to him, and speak to him at morning and at night. Would that the stars yet shone, for surely Dalbert would be among them, smiling down at his son, watching over him and his kin. We might as well go to Faye from there then. That's an interesting outcome. Long after the rites had ended, Faye admitted that she knew well before the fact that she would not be going home again. At least she had a very strong feeling. She ended up not minding very much, because she had little to return to in the Commonwealth. Her sense of home had changed. She took to wandering from one celestial landmark to the next, ever paying homage to the 8 scribes, who she believed had influenced all that had transpired. She was no stranger to traveling alone, but she was also happy to have company. Among her friends, she always remained close with Tizo, who, more so than anyone, could always make her laugh. Although they could not see each other any longer, Faye often thought about Jodariel, who spoke to her as though she were there. Faye tried never to make a decision without first consulting her idea of what Miss Jodariel might say. One day, she encountered one of her former adversaries, one called Almer Oldheart, who had served the Fate. She remembered him much more than he did her, although only just at first. Their shared experience in the rites, and their different points of view about the scribes, formed the basis of what grew to be a long-lasting relationship. Faye always was devoted to her faith, but more so to her friends. Her gentle manner and unwavering conviction often helped them brave life in the downside, both with courage and with grace. Speaking of Tizo, once the rites ended, the imp Tizo had a job to do, quite unlike most exiles trapped forever in the downside. The lone minstrel asked that he watch over the Black Wagon, which the Nightwings had used extensively for travel and for shelter all throughout their quest. Tizo obliged, for he knew the wagon, as well as its drive imp inhabitants, better than anyone. What became of the wagon exactly was never verified, as evidence of Tizo's thorough work. After that, he liked to while away his days with any of his friends, or else with fellow imps. He would visit his friend Faye at every opportunity. She was among the few who could consistently interpret what he meant, and they were always close since first they met. Sandlewood sometimes called for his assistance, and Tizo was always happy to oblige. The two would often reminisce about their times with the lone minstrel. Tizo often missed his interactions with the reader of the Nightwings. They had quickly built quite a rapport back in the downside. Indeed, Tizo would often express wistful gratitude for his time with the Nightwings, and meant their many adventures throughout the land that was always his home. Other than that, Tizo would sometimes help interpret for messenger imps relaying news to and from the Saurian Union. The Saurian Union, our nation, formed 839 AS after the fall of Commonwealth. One day, we all may stand shoulder to shoulder with a common cause. Wolford Sandlewood. Despite having gained significant celebrity abroad, he never let it go to his head. And he would go fishing in the Sea of Solace at every chance he got. So many characters along this thing. Let's get this spiteful shit out of the way. When Manly Tinderstaff realized the rites had ended, and that he no longer could return to the Commonwealth through the ancient means, he was outraged. He cursed the scribes, spewing forth such a slew of blasphemy as to be very unbecoming of one of such high status and bearing. When at last he calmed himself, he focused all his energies on attempting to find another means of homecoming. He maintained regular contact with his wealthy family on the other side via messenger imp, and used their vast resources to explore other means of escape. He tried using an elaborate pulley system. He attempted to retrofit a flying black wagon with superior propulsion. He tried an imp raft, a hot air balloon, even prayer. Nothing worked. There was only one way to escape the downside, and now it was gone. Tinderstaff bankrupted his family with these vain attempts. At last, such was his shame that he retreated to the teeming woods of Black Basin to Cinderroot. There he yet wallows, complaining to his comrades of the chastity who still put up with him, either about his own misfortune or the latest news of the other side. Oh, Poor guy. Not at all thinking that, actually. Screw that guy. So it would seem that, after all, no one really did get to ultimately escape. Everybody who left had to stay for good. Hey, Ron. No? Oh, you just can't highlight the top part. With the rights drawn to a close, the slug market's revenues fell precipitously, and Falcon Ron was forced to liquidate his assets and close up shop. Yet, as is sometimes the case with those of an entrepreneurial leaning, this time of hardship led to an epiphany, or at least a sudden change of fortune. One day, Falcon Ron had a run-in with a messenger imp bearing news from the other side. Ron gave to it one of his remaining trinkets, which could not be sold. The following week, the messenger imp returned to him, bearing a tidy sum of wealth in newly minted coinage from the Sarin Union. Falcon Ron cut a long-term deal with the messenger imp then and there. Though his trade remained a gray area from a legal standpoint of the Sarin Union, the newfound fame of the downside caused Falcon Ron's goods to explode in popularity. He later signed an elaborate agreement with Big Bertrude's, and found a distribution partner on the other side through Rookie Greentail, whose own business had expanded. Rookie! He's an opportunistic and well-connected clinging to his once comfortable lifestyle. Poor... Man, Rookie's been gone for a long time now. So Rookie's still helping out Ron on the other side. Especially in the Sarin Union, Falcon Ron's goods are still known for their superior quality, though he assumes no liability for any side effects. Oh, Falcon Ron. Let's go to some of the more relevant characters that don't connect to anybody. You're the main one, really. After the cycle of the rites had ceased, Witch Udmilda returned to the Flagging Hands region, where she sealed herself in the Pit of Millith. There, even her fellow exiles of the Withdrawn allegedly grew unnerved after a time and left her to her vile work. Sometime later, the Pit of Millith erupted into flame. So intense was the conflagration that it could be seen all the way from Jomora Valley. Arson was suspected, although the cause was never verified, and many bog dwellers in the region were forced to flee. A tempest blowing from the north finally quenched the flames. When at last the ashes settled, and the grounds had cooled, the site of the fire was scarred beyond recognition. No trace of Witch Udmilda could be found. As for the contents of the Pit of Millith, which notably included a profane object thought to be the remains of Isalk, all of it was gone as well. Back in the Sarin Union, Udmilda's repeated threats of the return of Isalk were thoroughly investigated, and no credence was found to any of her claims. This coward over here. Let's go with the crystal next. After the cycle of the rites ceased turning, records of what happened to the Black Wagon of the Nightwings became inconclusive and contradictory. Some accounts suggest the exiles of the Nightwings who remained in the downside continued to make use of the Black Wagon as their place of shelter and their means of travel. However, there is no record of what happened to the wagon's contents, such as the Book of Rites or the Beyonder Crystal, said to be haunted by the apparition Sandra the Unseeing. One possibility is that when the Lone Minstrel took his leave, he took the Beyonder Crystal with him, for he was thus obliged. By this line of reasoning, however, the Black Wagon itself should have been taken also. Others remain skeptical that the Beyonder Crystal ever existed, or rather that the visions that it granted were anything other than the result of an active imagination or a fever dream. The bog dwellers of the southern bogs often offer still another explanation, for they are familiar with binding enchantments. If there existed such an object, in which the Sisters of the Arch had been expelled for more than 800 years, then the enchantment could have expired along with the light of the stars. What this would have meant for Sandra and the Beyonders is difficult to say for certain, other than it may have meant that they were finally released. Nevertheless, the fates of Sandra and the Beyonder Crystal remain unknown. Yet those exiles of the Nightwings who claimed to have seen this apparition all spoke of her with degrees of reverence, or perhaps a little fear. Can you believe this, reader? Honestly. Sandra's appeared before you, as well you can see. They are so far from the mark with all this nonsense, I am wont to laugh. In fact, here goes. She laughs. She's referring to the account of her. You sense she does not care for it. Well, let them gossip all they like. I merely wish that they would mention you, at least in passing, when next they are at it. Though they shall never even know the half of it, shall they? Sandra seems irritated by the incomplete account of what happened to her. Let's just humor her. Perhaps making some light of the situation will make Sandra feel better. You indicate to Sandra that the real truth of what happened between you would perhaps make too less lascivious of a tale to be told in such a format. I'm not used to that word. She makes a bemused sound at this. Perhaps that story ought to get out then. To think that they would go to all the trouble to make literacy accepted once again, only to print such drivel. Anyway, let us keep going, lovely reader. We know the truth of it. That is what matters. She fades into the Beyonder crystal for now, and you tuck it away, safe. Okay, so now we've established something. So people that I have contact with might talk to me, because she is here. So all of these glowing characters might actually have a conversation with me after their little story, because they are in the same place as me and I am here. Or maybe it's just her specifically. Hard to say. Check with these two. After the cycle of the Rite ceased churning, the lone minstrel baited the remaining Nightwings take the Black Wagon, then seek their fortune elsewhere on the downside. Their parting was heartfelt but brief. He remained there, at the summit of Mount Elodiel with Celeste, where the two of them would chronicle the final outcome of the cycle. Neither Tariq nor Celeste were ever seen again. We know all this now through the song attributed to them. Some claim these songs originated in the taverns of the Siren Union, and merely were imbued with the weight of the folklore. However, exiles liberated from the downside corroborated each other's claims at having met this duo that presided over the liberation rites. Another folk tale suggests that these minstrels were heralds of the scribes. Having fulfilled their obligations, they departed the world we know and rejoined their patrons. One of their famous songs describes another simpler outcome: that the two gave up their duties to the rites in favor of a life that they could share together. In any case, they are likely to remain the subject of such verses and such songs, for it was they who watched over the rites and ushered in our times. Bye-bye. You're probably the loosest end. Once it became clear to Ignarius that the rites were drawing to a close, he knew it was time for him and the Tempers to call it quits. But first, he and the Tempers decided to celebrate, and that they did for many, many nights. The revelry did eventually subside. The exiles parted amicably and went their separate ways. He roamed the downside then, searching for some meaning in his life. Sometimes taking odd jobs requiring his brute strength. He never remained alone for very long, and took on many lovers in his time. However, he sometimes thought about the one he had called Curly Horns, and what became of her. Though his glory days as the most powerful conductor of the riots had long since passed, he always enjoyed the fearsome reputation he had cultivated at the time. All his life, Sir Deluge had fled from one danger, only to find himself facing another. He had escaped the war-torn waters of the sea domain, he had escaped the blood border of the Commonwealth, and now he had escaped the rites. After the rites had ended, many exiles wrapped up in the ancient test were crestfallen, as their last chances to return to their homes vanished, along with the stars above. But Deluge did not mind, for this outcome meant that at last there was no burden of responsibility weighing down on him. While most of his fellow exiles of the Pyre hearts yet longed for the waters of the sea domain, driven as ever by their impulses towards conflict, Deluge settled down. With him remained one of his companions, the one lady Seagrass, who had taken a liking to him for some reason. Reportedly, they disappeared into the waters of the Worm Gulf, which may begin to explain the significant increase in the worm population observed in the vicinity. That song comes back in. Barker Ashe Paz never had much interest in returning to the Commonwealth, for he always found its bylaws to be stifling. So when the rites ended, he did not care at first. He soon grew very bored. The rites had given his life a certain sense of structure he had always needed. He missed the raw anticipation of it all. He decided to continue conducting the rites for the thrill of it all. He bent some of the rules and replaced some of the objects, but it was close enough. His packmates, the dissidents, proved more than happy to participate, and thus they ran against each other back in Jomora Valley. Gradually, other exiles familiar with the rites, as well as those who had not heard of it all, started to take an interest. They ended up giving Barker Ashe Paz some healthy competition. His old feud with Rookie Greentail ceased meaning anything to him, and he forgot all about it amid his new pursuits. Ultimately, even Barker Ashe Paz, who had led such a directionless existence in his past, found something of a calling through the rites. Whether he took the rites less seriously than any other of his time, or more, was oft debated by those who watched him work. That's a really interesting outcome. He was just such a mindless, random rebel that would just do whatever the hell he felt like and had no real goals or direction in his life. And then, when the liberation came to an end, he just brought the rites back, not as a magical, mystical thing that had pomp and circumstance and importance and function, but just turned it into a sport in the wasteland. And he created his own sport that people would play, and he spread it to everybody in the Commonwealth instead of just the people that knew about the liberation rites and the secrets therein, and basically probably had the best possible outcome ever. So I guess I guess Barker staying in the down. I always want to call it Downwell because that's a different game. In the downside, it's like the best possible outcome. Much like how it seems like Faye generally does well with the idea of staying here. Ah, damn! I'm gonna need more water soon with all this. I'm like 90 minutes into reading and constantly talking. When you do a reading game as opposed to normal commentary, the density of how much talking you do goes up compared to just like random, like I'm just saying comments a few sentences at a time and then going quiet for a moment. It actually goes, you get a little raw. After the Shimmer Pool closed for what would be the last time, Oralech looked around him, in the flickering light of the Nightwing's still burning pyre. He then turned towards the Fall of Solium and looked up towards the black, starless sky. After standing thus for some time, he averted his gaze and walked away without a word. Oralech had relinquished his freedom of his own free will. Perhaps in realizing this, he saw no reason to remain there on the sacred mountain. For many moons, he wandered the downside alone. Eventually, however, he would reunite with the exiles he stood with as the true Nightwings, for they each cared for him. The one he called the Shadow of the False Nightwings was someone whom he thought about at times. He wondered if this reader had an influence over the Commonwealth's fall. News must have reached him, eventually, about the outcome of Wulfric Sandlewood's plan. One day, he appeared before his former companion. Does it still say a percentage lately? Nope, there's no percentage anymore. I was wondering if it would still indicate something, like if they updated it. One day, he appeared before his former companion. While they kept private the details of the conversation that took place, it must have been enough to rebuild the bonds of friendship between the two of them. They were often seen together after that. Oralech remained reunited. Oralech later reunited with Tiazo, who joined his travels. It was much like the olden times, in that regard, and the imp always enjoyed his company. Still, in the Saurian Union, no one remembered the former chief physician who had fallen into exiles decades prior. No one knew just how close he came to altering the outcome of the final liberation rite, and thus, perhaps, to altering the course of history. Today, however, this is not the case. Accounts of other exiles in the downside have ensured that Oralech's place in the events that shaped our world are known, and shall be known. So he's honored by history as an outcome of what happened. Because he did a huge thing there. After fighting for so long he earned his victory twice. And it was robbed from him the first time, and then he gave it up the second time. Like, that's insane. That makes him one of the biggest heroes of the entire story. Maybe the biggest one. When the cycle of the rites ceased turning, Volfred Sandlewood turned towards the starless sky and closed his eyes and prayed. It was all he could do at that stage of his plan. He aspired to assemble with liberated exiles representing each of the 8 largest ethnic groups composing the population of the Commonwealth. They would stand together as a vision of the 8 scribes returned, inspiring the masses to embrace an older set of values, from before the Commonwealth had tightened its grip. With the rites ending sooner than expected, this ideal scenario became impossible. Sandalwood's own freedom, for instance, was now forfeit, yet the plan did have contingencies. Word reached him that, on the night of the scribe's return, several of his fellow liberated Nightwings stood together and their voices echoed through the streets. Scribe's return, inspired by the liberated exiles, the people of the Commonwealth demanded new leadership. Cast yourself down. Cast yourselves down, chant from the scribe's return. Oh, telling the leadership to cast themselves to the downside. It was vital to Sandalwood that this stand against the Commonwealth be peaceful in nature, but this proved to be untenable, especially after the Highwing remnants appeared. There was speculation that their well-timed assault may not have happened by coincidence, though Sandalwood denied any involvement and regretted the bloodshed. Nevertheless, the main thrust of the plan had been achieved. Sandalwood kept busy after that as much as possible, providing counsel from afar to those who would be at the forefront of the birth of the Saurian Union. Of course, being stranded in the downside meant that there was only so much he could do. Resting assured that the future of the nation was in capable hands, he turned his attention to the remaining exiles of the downside. They might never return to that new nation, but at least they could experience its triumphs and its struggle in some vicarious way, so he took to his old work, writing and printing. As literacy began to spread again through the Saurian Union, so too did exiles of the downside take to it. For his part, Sandalwood helped teach as many as he could. More than that, he provided the material to read, a semi-annual report about the latest events both in the Saurian Union and the downside. This periodical gave many exiles something to look forward to. One of his allies in all this was the Tizo, with whom he traveled all across the downside. Sandalwood often cited Tizo as the wellspring of his own enthusiasm for a brighter future. Such was the creature's spirit. He enjoyed exchanging letters with the reader of the Nightwings, who kept him well abreast of how their other comrades and their fledgling nation fared. It is said that, at some point, he made amends with his old, one-time friend Oralech, with whom he clashed during their days as exiles. After that, they seldom traveled separately. As Volfred Sandalwood gained more fame throughout this land for his sacrifices and his contributions, it is said that he remained steadfast about 2 things. The first was that the cause itself ought to remain in focus, the freedom that the people had achieved. It was a gift to be cherished, a set of values that needed to be nurtured. The second point he made was that he himself had little to do with the outcome. He would often praise the exiles of the Nightwings who had stood with him, each in turn, by name. He never forgot any of them. One day, to commemorate his birthday, the people of the Saurian Union unveiled a monument depicting him and the Nightwings as imagined in their prime. While Sandalwood did not learn of it until much later, it is said that he was moved to tears then by the gesture. It has since ensured that those of us with memories more fallible than that of Sandalwood likewise remember the achievements of his fellow former exiles and our cause. Shall we cover the sisters next? You can tell I've waited specifically for that. After the rites ended, Pamitha parted ways with the other Nightwings, stating that she needed time alone. She reassured She reappeared sometime after the fall of the Commonwealth, although she expressed mild surprise at the news. She claimed to have no knowledge of what went on, including what role the Highwing Remnants had in the events that reshaped the world on the other side. For her part, Pamitha feigned little interest, making the point that they were stuck, and what happened elsewhere had little to do with them now. Pamitha never saw her blood sister again, though did hear of her. By some accounts, Tamitha played no small part in the historical last days of the Commonwealth. In turn, Tamitha must have heard something of her blood sister, however, she never responded to Pamitha's attempts to contact her. Pamitha did not expect forgiveness from her at any point. Nonetheless, she kept on trying to reach out. She said to ruffle up her feathers just a bit. Having long since felt as though she had no home to call her own, Pamitha continued traveling around the downside. As the tempest swept across the land, changing its features, she found it in a sublime beauty, and in the starless nights, she could see just fine. She said such travels tended to remind her of when she was younger and could fly unfettered. As soon as possible after Tamitha Thane earned back her liberty, she rejoined her sisters of the Highwing Remnants in the mountains north of the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth believed that someone such as she could be rehabilitated through years spent in exile. Instead, her hatred for her ancient enemies had only intensified. On the night of the scribe's return, the Highwing Remnants were poised to strike the Commonwealth in a decisive blow. They had received credible intelligence about the expected positions of the Commonwealth leadership, and of specific weaknesses in the blood border defenses anticipated that night. After a surgical procedure, Tamitha could fly again, almost as well as prior to her exile. She insisted on spearheading the attack, with a squadron of Harp's finest. They descended on their foes exactly as planned. The chaos that had risen in the streets of the Commonwealth that night made for an optimal diversion. Nonetheless, the battle took its toll. Many of Tamitha's sisters fell. She herself sustained many grievous wounds, but ignored them all, and fought with a terrible fury. By dawn, the leaders of the Commonwealth had been eliminated, and Tamitha was limping back towards the mountains. She would never fly again. Soon after the fall of the Commonwealth, Tamitha attended a debriefing in which she learned her blood sister Pamitha was an accessory to the successful outcome. Tamitha was very skeptical of this, but so many of the Highwing Remnants honored Pamitha, and Tamitha soon accepted the prevailing opinion, though grudgingly at first. A messenger imp later arrived bearing some sort of message, seemingly from Pamitha. However, Tamitha turned it away. She forever resisted the impulse to forgive. After the rise of the Saurian Union, Tamitha Thane continued to serve as flight tactician and remained respected and feared, even among her kind. However, without a war to wage, she grew more distant ever than usual. Those closest to her surmised that her inability to reconcile with her blood sister was at the heart of this, though for her part, Tamitha never once admitted to any such weakness. So she's the one person I let slip through that managed to free themselves despite my group. And it might have been a decent choice. The ideal thing would be to have a peaceful revolution, but the chances of that happening are iffy, and who knows if that was really a thing. But she managed to instead be a part of the violent revolution, which is unfortunate, but it sounds like the violence was breaking out without them even arriving, so the fact that they took that time to defeat the leadership of the Commonwealth and end these horrible behaviors means that, in a ruthless, potentially horrible sort of way, she might have been more effective towards the plan in a way than any of the other characters, even though she wasn't one of our allies. Let us start with the most long ago seen character, Hedwin. We hardly knew ya. After his liberation, Hedwin was instrumental in the events leading to the fall of the Commonwealth, and was vital to the outcome of the plan. He was the one who led the raid on the stronghold where Archjustice Androbles IX was holed up when fighting grew fierce. With him, then and thereafter, was one of the winged harps of the Highwing Remnants, later identified as Fikani Sheng. Bikani Sheng, a harp for whom Hedwin cared deeply. They were separated when Hedwin was exiled. Damn. So he attacked the guy that's been talking to us this entire time during all the rites, and he did so alongside his companion that he has been reacquainted with now and apparently still lives with. Their bond was vital to the peace that followed. In all his days as a leader of the Saurian Union, Hedwin oft confided in his friend Jodariel. Despite her intense manner, there was no one whom he trusted more in times when circumspection was required. Hedwin would often think back to the vow he made at the beginning of his quest for freedom. Although he cherished all the friendships he made, he had pledged to Jodariel, Rookie Greentail, and the Reader of the Nightwings that they might all be free again together. His promise had come to pass, though he always knew that this was not his own doing. And he was always deeply grateful to the other three, his closest friends. Yeah, he's right. His original promise came true, even though we were told it never could be because of the whole reader problem. While the others who stood with the Nightwings were not all able to remain in contact thus, Hedwin thought of each of them often, and so, in turn, did they often think of him. Well, I guess you did meet everyone, huh? I was gonna say you didn't meet Bertrude, but Bertrude made their way to the Commonwealth, so they would have met at that point, even though they never were alongside each other on the rites. In fact, I think how late did Bertrude join? I want to say that Rookie and Hedwin were both free already. When the worm Gilman returned to the Commonwealth, he believed that he had regained something even more important than his freedom: his honor. Gilman relinquished his knighthood and declined an opportunity to serve as captain on the Blood Border. He was not interested in fighting any longer. Yet, as is sometimes the case with those such as he, a circumstance soon came about in which there came a need for him to once again make use of his military training. He fought. The night of the scribe's return. He fought with all his might. He faced other worm knights. He cared only for the cause. When the matter was at last put to rest, then Gilman truly knew his time as a knight had ended. He declared to all those in earshot that he would never fight again. Unless, of course, there arose some other extraordinary set of circumstances, again requiring him to fight, but he certainly hoped not. He still trained regularly, just in case, especially with his fleet-footed friend, Rookie Greentail. From time to time, he would seek guidance from one of his former comrades, Big Bertrude, much his elder, and a wellspring of perspective on his life decisions. He was always grateful for the counsel of the Reader, and would regale him over and over about the time they squashed the spawn of the unfathomed plurns. By that point, he had long forgotten about his day under the leadership of Sir Deluge, his former commander. Breaking free of his abusive leadership was his first step towards gaining a bit of self-respect. Gilman never did return to his homeland, the Sea Domain, and was content to lead a monastic life on a small residence in the hills. It was just high up enough to make him keep striving to conquer this fear of heights. Other than that, an intense daily training regimen and the occasional visit from an old companion were more than enough to keep him optimistic and engaged. He knew by then that honor was not something to be won, but a contract with oneself to be renewed each day. After returning to the Commonwealth, the crone known as Big Bertrude promptly returned to wet climate of her ancestral home in the southern bogs. There, for a time, it appeared that she had distanced herself from any involvement with society or with the plan of which she was a part. We know now that she worked diligently towards the goals outlined by Sandlewood, yet well outside the notice of even those who watched her movements closely. For example, the printed notices spread throughout the streets about the scribe's return were all her doing, yet no one knew until she owned up to it much later. Subsequently, she returned her focus to the sort of work which had preoccupied her for many, many years, both in the downside and in the Commonwealth. And she remotely managed aspects of her business in the downside, ensuring that the exiles who remained there still could get a hold of certain valuables. Much of her efforts were doubtless due to the influence of Volfred Sandlewood, someone whom she had admired now for decades. Though they were very far apart now, she sought out news of his whereabouts and often cast enchantments in his favor. Bertrude, most of all, kept busy with her work. The inks and notices, which she still brewed and manufactured, once were grounds enough for a quick sentence into exile. Back then, the one thing worse than spreading lies about the Commonwealth through speech was doing so in print. Once exposed, such writings were all burned. Now, the written point of view is to be honored rather than feared, and Big Bertrude remains one of our time's most notable purveyors of this craft. It is quite likely something you have read in recent times would have been put to parchment by her handiwork. Yeah, she got to live out her career she was going for, even if she was unfortunately separated by Sandlewood in the end. Almost there. After her liberation, Jodariel soon became an icon of the movement that led to the collapse of the Commonwealth and the rise of the Saurian Union. Her military prowess and experience led to key victories in clashes against the Commonwealth loyalists. Each time, she was able to subdue the opposition, avoiding lethal force. In the uncertain times that followed, Jodariel's seasoned expertise often came into play both in matters of security and state. For instance, she conscripted and trained a team of volunteers in public safety. The community did not know what to make of such a cordial bunch at first, but soon came to value their service. They have stood for the people ever since, and we celebrate their founding day each year. She remained close to Hedwin all through this experience, and they supported each other through their struggles many times. She often had to stop herself from fearing for Faye, whom she had tried to look after as much as possible on the downside. Soon, she would reassure herself that Faye was very capable of surviving on her own, and, in fact, she was not mistaken. She never settled down with anyone, although from time to time, she thought of Ignarius, despite herself. She continued training on her own, a regimen that grew stricter with each passing year. There were those who sought to train with her, and she sometimes obliged. There remained one other constant in her life. She would always remember her days among the Nightwings, and with fondness for the most part. Rookie. After Rookie Greentail earned back his freedom, he returned to a lavish welcome ceremony in the Commonwealth, as was the tendency for liberated exiles. It was everything he could have hoped for, and soon he was well off, surrounded by luxury, and choosing between various exciting opportunities. However, he must have given into his better judgment, as he did end up siding with Volfred Sandlewood's revolutionary forces as promised. On the night of Scribe's return, Greentail kept busy barking orders to Volfred's agents as the situation grew tenser. He took rather well to leadership. When dawn finally came, it became clear that the Commonwealth that everybody knew would be no more. He realized many new opportunities awaited. He began quite a lucrative career for himself, manufacturing and selling replica merchandise inspired by the downside. His main struggle was to meet demand. An aspect of his conscience cautioned him against making light of such a thing, but the money was too good, and soon his family was as well off as he always said. He also kept in touch with Gilman, ever the perfect practice partner. They would train together often, taking care to stay in tip-top shape as much as possible throughout the years. Greentail always did his best to keep in touch with all his many friends, and knew that he owed his fortunes to them. He made a special point of staying close with the group of friends he came to know so well during his time with the Nightwings, wherever they were. They shared a special understanding that put even Greentail at a loss of words sometimes. There is one more account which warrants mention. The Nightwings conducted the rites under the guidance of a reader. Little is known of him. However, some accounts of him began to paint a picture. We know he was of common birth. Weak-framed, though raised with a penchant for learning. The journey to the downside left him close to death. It was then that the Nightwings found him. They brought him from the brink. He showed them the path. He pressed onward with the others. He had made a vow to help his friends be free. Thus did the cycle of the rites commence its final turns. When the final rite arrived, the reader's freedom was at stake. That freedom he, indeed, achieved ere the morning's light. From that point on, accounts of him diverge. It is said the voice which troubled him he never heard again. Some say he helped to form our Saurian Union, though whether that is true only he knows. Someday, perhaps, that reader's own star shall emerge. Then it shall pierce the dark of night in all its brilliant glory. Until such time, and ever after, all of us give thanks.
Their journey began on a barren waste where the reader arrived, afraid and alone. When he arrived, the book of rites awakened the night wings and ignited the flame. They follow the stars bound together, strands in our brain till the end. We sing of the last of the night wings who, having broken the cycle, shall live on in song. Hedwin prevailed and strode the path that his heart laid before him. He has found his way home. Captain Jodariel, mother to many a foundling, she has found her way home. Rookie Greentail has proved his worth and returned to his family by the grace of the scribe. They follow the stars bound together, strands in a braid till the end.
The moon-touched girl feels the scribes in the heart of the downside. She remained to the end. Tease all the wise, ever faithful to the cause of the night wings. He remained to the end.
Sir Gilman the bold, ever in his quest, finding honor and glory, he has found his way home. Amethyst Thane, born on guilty wings, ever seeking forgiveness, she remained till the end. They follow the stars bound together, strands in a braid till the end. Bound together, spirits turn, strands in a braid till the end.
mastermind. Wolfred Sandlewood saw his plans turn to action. He remained till the end.
The enchanter Gertrude made her rivals pay with the darkest of curses. She has found her way home. The reader at last made the night wings whole and ascended to freedom. He has found his way home. To the stars, we shall find our way home. We shall find our way home. We shall find our way home.
Well, that was fantastic. Knowing the previous games, I'm sitting here waiting for the credits song. I'm like, here it goes, here it goes. I'm like, oh, it's gonna like give another update on all the different characters, and it's gonna apparently adapt to what happened to each one, and it's gonna address every single character. And it's good to address the characters. It's good that the entire epilogue chunk was all about what happened to each character individually, because while the constant thing, it's always constantly about the commonwealth, like that's the background detail. But it always was a background detail. It was always more about... It was always a character-driven story about, like, here's your 9 characters. What's going to happen to them? Well, more than 9. More like 12. More like 20 characters of varying significance and screen time. But it was always a matter of, like, what's going to happen with these characters. You're making decisions that genuinely affect all of them on an individual basis and where the rest of their life is going to go. Like, regardless of the Commonwealth's revolution itself, there is a binary split for every character of what their life's going to be like for the rest of their life, and you're choosing which ones it happens to. And even the act of not picking one of them picks somebody else to have it happen to. And like it's such a cool idea for a story, and there's so many permutations. And yeah, it's one of those stories where people would argue that it doesn't change massively by the end, but the meaning behind all the decisions is meaningful enough that I think it's worthwhile. Like, this is what a lot of people are hoping for when they look for a proper RPG where you're actually doing things along the way that make decisions. And I love the fact that you can't just click on the right menu. You're not just clicking on menu options. It's not a BioWare game or a visual novel where it's just you click on the right branch and then it just happens and then gameplay occurs separately. Because there's a constant problem in video games, and not every game can address this, but it's the issue that when a game wants to be story-driven, oftentimes the mechanics and the gameplay are completely divorced from each other. Whenever it's time for a video game to be a video game, air quotes, it often stops being a story, and then whenever it starts being a story, it stops being a video game, and they often don't know how to mix the two together. One of the main things that knows how to do this is a lot of walking simulators have actually figured this out a little bit, in that a lot of walking simulators will happen in a situation where it's like a very tame situation where somebody is going to some house and exploring this house and uncovering details about their past or someone's past and things like that. Something like What Remains of Edith Finch, for example, is like, that's a game that does a good job at marrying its gameplay with its story, but many would argue it does so by diminishing its gameplay's existence altogether, by making the core gameplay the story. But it is an elegant solution for that specific type of storytelling. Other games that do this well are what's often called the 0451 games, or the games like Deus Ex and Prey, and those types of games, the Bioshocky type games, the System Shocks, the games where you can, any game where you can just shoot a person that's an important NPC and they just die and the story has to adapt to that as you go, like those kinds of games are often very good at making their mechanics and their story intertwined in a way where it feels like they're actually existing in the same world and not in cutscene land versus video game land, which is a really cool thing. And this game is a particular solution that I very rarely see. Every now and then you'll see me praise some vague specter of what I think I remember Shenmue being like, because once upon a time I played Shenmue when it was new, so it's so long now that I don't even really remember it, but the main thing I remember happening is that it had quicktime events, which I had not seen before. But what it did that was cool about them is the quicktime events, if you failed them, the story would keep going, at least in some cases. I think you might be able to die in some cases, but I'm not sure, but there were cases where a bad thing could happen because you failed a quicktime event and the story would just keep going. And that's been iterated on more recently, in particular by in variable amounts by Telltale games, although frankly lately in Telltale games you can fail quicktime events and you still win anyway, and it's like, why am I even playing this video game? But in games like a little bit of Beyond Two Souls, but especially in Until Dawn, there are games lately where the quicktime events and the in-game stuff will have branching story elements. And that's like, oh, now these things matter. It's not just a story. It's not a thing where I just have to do quicktime events and do it successfully, and it'll just keep repeating until I do it right. It'll actually affect the story. And this game does something similar, which is that the gameplay itself determines the branch of the story. You make a decision, and then you have to earn the ability to actually make that decision, essentially. You're making tons of minor decisions, like which character to favor here and there, and a bunch of different decisions, and who likes what, and who feels about what, and how, and like different things that happen on an Oregon Trail sort of way of what'll happen in these branching paths on the physical, actual branching path. But the biggest decision, of course, is liberating people, and the act of liberating people is a challenge. You don't just say, I want Garrus to be happy, so I'll click the make Garrus happy button, and he'll be happy now because I made him happy. It's like, no, I want Ruki to go free. Shit. time to earn Ruki's freedom, and I don't want to screw it up. And like that stuff's really cool. That's a really cool way to tell a story, and I want to see more and more video games experiment with ways to intertwine the gameplay with the story in their story-driven games, so it doesn't feel like the story takes place in a book that somebody reads separately in a different room from the actual gameplay, which is a problem that BioWare games in particular have, because usually the gameplay literally can't affect the story ever, which is rough. So this is a really cool game, beautiful, great to listen to, memorable characters and story, fun gameplay. Still trips me up like crazy. I'll call it fun. I don't know if I'll call it entirely intuitive. Definitely has a very high skill ceiling. It really screws my head. I'm still really amused by the fact that because I was so radio silent on this game, I managed to walk into it not knowing it was a sports game. To the point where I was like I was more than an episode in and still being like, is this what this game is or not? I can't tell. But I was like, is this game NBA Jam crossed with the visual novel or not? Because I genuinely thought the first few levels were like a tutorial to teach you the controls, and then you were going to go on to play an RPG. Because until now they made action RPGs, so I thought this was going to be another one. I was super wrong. In fact, judging it just by the top-down camera, I thought it was a turn-based action I thought it was a turn-based strategy RPG, where you would take turns trying to fight each other, like many 3-on-3 turn-based strategy RPGs that are popular lately. Nope, it's NBA Jam visual novel. What? Did not see it coming. This game and Zelda are probably the most pleasant surprises of this year. I can't really call Prey a surprise because everybody was making it abundantly clear that I was probably going to think it was a Game of the Year contender when I played it, well before I played it, and then I played it, I'm like, yeah, that's about right. So I can't call that one as surprising. But yeah, Pyre and Prey and Zelda Breath of the Wild are definitely the 3 top shelf games this year that come to mind right now. And yes, I am still amused by the fact that I replaced Prey with Pyre, and Prey and Pyre are freaking anagrams of each other, and that's weird. And they share the same time slot. I'm almost certain whatever comes next in this time slot will not be an anagram, because that'd be too weird. And I can't think of another word that you can even spell with those letters, but you never know. Thanks for watching like always, guys. Hope you enjoyed the playthrough. Feel free, and if you haven't yet, you should check this game out. Even though you know where the story goes, you know that you still have to play it yourself. You still have to make decisions, and you can free different people and do different things along the way and have your own version of the story where you maybe get to know Hedwin better because you don't liberate him literally first, and maybe you fail more rites than I do and you get to see what happens when the plan has a lower success % chance, or when certain other people go free that you didn't necessarily want to, or maybe you'll intentionally lose to Old Heart just to give him his chance at freedom. Maybe you'll even try to see if you're allowed to make him lose twice, but I don't think you can do that. I think he'll be crossed out, but it'd be amazing if you could lose to the Old Hearts twice somehow and liberate both of the leading characters. That'd be interesting. The cast is great, by the way. Like, they were so careful to make every single character interesting for different reasons, and every enemy interesting for different reasons, and then also create bonds between the characters. Like, you have rivalries. You have a rivalry between the 2 worms. You have a potentially antagonistic problem between the 2 curs, although the extent to which the other guy even cares about the grudge is variable, because Barker doesn't care about a lot of things, necessarily, and maybe he was just holding on to the grudge for fun anyway. And then you have the 2 sisters, and like that part where like even when you're liberating her, she prays that we fail so the other one can be liberated. Like, there's so many tiny details about the interpersonal relationships between every combination of characters in your party, and between those party members and several possible people outside the party. Like, it's a nightmare spiderweb of really cool storytelling. This is character-driven storytelling, and that's what I like. I like characters more than I like plots, and playing a game that was more about the characters than the plot has been a treat. Especially since I would argue that the last 2 games by this company were more about the plot than the characters on some level. Especially Bastion in particular, but I guess it's a little No, they've all been fairly character-driven. They just they were more heavy-handed with the plot than they were this time around, where this is... Yeah, I think I'd put all 3 of their games on the character-driven side of the spectrum, but this one's the furthest in that direction, I would say. Anyway, guys, hope you enjoyed the game, hope you enjoyed the series. I'll see you next time. And at some point, I'm sure I'll play Bastion. At some point. Gotta get around to that. I do.